This is the last lecture in texture mapping, where we study texture mapping functions and the overall process in OpenGL. You can control how texture is applied by calling GL texture environment, and then you select one out of float or integer, and the V here is optional. It takes three parameters: GL texture environment, name, and a third parameter. Name basically is the symbolic name of a texture environment parameter. For example, GL texture environment mode. There are 19 others. See documentation for details. Parameter may be one of the following three. GL modulate. This will modulate with computed shade. Modulate the texture with the computed shade. GL blend will blend with an environmental color. GL replace will use only the texture color and will discard the environment color and other values. Here is a specific example usage. GL text and I, and we have not used the V over here. We are setting the GL texture environment and GL texture environment mode, and we are using GL blend, which will blend the texture with the environment color. Now, this is a complete sequence of using texture objects. Perhaps looking at the code in example 1.cpp that comes with chapter 7 code, you can look at the zip file in your labs that will contain example 1.cpp in the chapter 7 code folder. It will give specific functions that will perform these operations sequentially. The first step is to specify textures in texture objects. Then we set the texture filter. Then we set the texture function. Then we set texture wrap mode, whether we want to wrap around or whether we want to clamp. Then optionally, we can set a perspective correction hint. Then we bind the texture object and enable texturing, and finally supply the texture coordinates for each vertex. These coordinates can also be generated inside the vertex shader. Texture are applied during fragment shading by a sampler. Samplers return a texture color from a texture object. Here is the sample code. We have an in vector 4 color that comes from the rasterizer. Remember that the vertex shader passes color down the pipeline, but it eventually goes to the rasterizer before it enters the fragment shader. We also have an in vector 2 which contains the texture coordinates coming from the rasterizer. So even though we would have passed a few texture coordinates down the pipeline, the rasterizer would fill in and interpolate the rest of the texture coordinates. Then we have a uniform variable sampler 2D type texture, and remember this uniform variable is coming from the program application. It is not coming from the vertex shader. For this particular case, we can calculate the fragment color as a product of color, which is the color of the 3D object, multiplied by the texture value. And here texture 2D is an inbuilt GLSL function. Notice that it is not defined anywhere else. It is an inbuilt function that you can call, and you can take a product of your color value with the values returned by texture 2D function, which uses the texture values and the coordinate locations to produce a specific color for each rasterized pixel. Now, going back to the vertex shader, usually vertex shader will output texture coordinates to be rasterized, but it must also do all other standard tasks that we have discussed in previous lectures, such as computation of the vertex position, computation of the vertex color if needed. So the in variables over here are coming from the program application, which is the vertex positions, the vertex colors, and the vertex texture coordinates. So all these in variables are coming from the application. The out variables are calculated inside the vertex shader and passed down the pipeline, and the pipeline does the interpolation. And we have the second out variable as texture coordinate over here. So while the vertex shader will calculate texture coordinates for a few vertices, when it goes down the pipeline, the rasterizer will fill in and will have a texture coordinate for each fragment that is a potential pixel. Here is a sample code from example 1.cpp that creates a checkerboard texture. As we have discussed before, you can write an application program that will generate some sort of texture, simplistic texture that could be calculated inside a double for loop to fill in the XY dimension or the ST dimensions of the image. We'll not go into the details of these codes. You can look at the full code in example 1.cpp to understand it. And here we are basically calculating the coordinates of the texture coordinates of the vertices. Now this is the sequence in which texture mapping is performed. We first defined an identifier for the texture objects. When we generate the textures and we bind the textures, then we use the text image 2D command to specify the type of texture mapping, the dimensionality and the MIP mapping levels that we want to use, and the type of texture that we have, and the size of the texture, the width and height of the texture image, and the type of the variable in which the image is stored, and finally a pointer to the actual values of the texture. And then we set the parameters, all the parameters that we want to set using the same function, but each time we specify a different parameter, starting with yield texture 2G because all the time it is a 2D texture. We specify first, for example, the S wrapping parameter to repeat, then the T dimension of the texture to repeat as well, and the magnifier filter to nearest. Probably we would like to use linear over here so that we get better results, but here we have set it to nearest. We may also specify the minification filter, which is again nearest here. We can use linear again over here, and then we finally activate texture. Now, when we are performing texture mapping of real images, the real images already have shading and shadows because these real images were captured in some environment where there were certain light sources and some reflections from other objects. And specifically, if we have a directional light source such as a sun, we may have strong shadows and self-occlusions, which will cause different types of shadows on the object. Now these shadows are already present on our texture map, and they may not correspond to the lighting sources in our graphics world. So if you want to generate a good texture map, we should not include shading or shadows in our texture map. We should try to take the image in an environment which would minimize the effect of shading and shadows. Such an image is also called an albedo, and it can only be captured in controlled conditions with perfect diffuse lighting. Light coming from all directions and multiple planar light sources that can be used to approximate such an effect. As we have discussed before, mapping 2D textures on 3D objects is problematic. However, if the texture was on the 3D object already, and we already have some sort of one-to-one mapping from the 3D object to the 2D texture, and in this case texture mapping works really well. This is generally achieved through three-dimensional scanners. So if you scan someone's face and the scanner goes all around or captures the face for multiple directions, you can get the image of the face from multiple directions and then open it up, warp it to a flat image. Would look something like this. But once this texture is mapped on the three-dimensional geometry of the face, it would look perfect. It would not have any effects of distortion and interpolation that are generally there when we are mapping a flat image onto a 3D object. So these are not flat images, these are sort of curved images flattened out, and hence they look weird. So this part looks as if you have a frontal view of the person, but if you look at from here, it's a side view of a person. The same goes for this image. So two side views or one frontal view. That's because it's captured with a scanner that moved in a semicircle in front of the face, or there were multiple scanners in front of the face. Here are examples of textures that are obtained from Make Human, the code that you are going to use in your project. So some messages that you can take from these texture maps, well, you can have one image contain the texture map of multiple locations on the 3D object. For example, here are the toes of which have a little bit different color. This is the face of the person. This is the rest of the body of the person. So they have all been sort of warped to a flat shape and then fitted onto a single image, and some parts of this image are not even used. Now this contains all the hair on the person's head. So this is the head here. These are perhaps some of them are eyebrows, some of them are eyelashes, and they've all been fitted into a separate image. This is the texture map for the trousers. So one side and the other side have been fitted onto an image, and because we are going to specify the coordinates, it doesn't matter whether they're upside down or left side right or in any way they are placed here. This is again t-shirts, upside down one side and right side up the other side. So this is the back side of the t-shirt, this is the front side of the t-shirt. Again, we have the shoes. The sole is kept in the same image over here, and the top of the shoe is warped open to cover the curved shape of the top shoe. We even have a texture map for the eyeball. So every part can have a different image, or multiple object part can have textures taken from a single image.